everybody. Thanks for coming to today's DASH event on open data and civic technology. This is something that a lot of different people are working on here on campus, and I wanted to use this space, this monthly DASH event space, to focus on some of the projects that are happening in this area and bring some people together from campus and from the community that are working on these really important topics. If you're not familiar with DASH, it is a project from the University of Minnesota Libraries that looks at different emerging technologies in research and teaching and publication. So crowdsourcing, data visualization, mapping, 3D printing, stuff like that, and providing this space for people to connect around them. What I like to say is that this is lowering the barriers of access to tools. We offer training and workshops and things like that, a lot of which are available online in recorded form, then lowering the barriers of access to people. So you can connect with folks on campus who are already doing this work and learn some stuff from them, contribute to a project, things like that. To quickly introduce the panel, we're going to have each of them say a little bit. I'll introduce you all one by one, and starting with Alex. And give a brief background of what they do, how they're related, and how their work intersects with this topic. And then we'll start off with a question that is from a recent book called Against the Smart City by Adam Greenfield. And then we'll have kind of an open conversation about it, both amongst the panelists and then with people here as well. So first, to my immediate left is Alex Fink. He is now a PhD candidate? No, okay.
Just close.
Close. A near PhD candidate, or a PhD near candidate in social work, but also runs this thing that he's going to talk about, which is the Open Knowledge Cast, Open Knowledge podcast series. And he will explain much more about that in a bit. To my left, or to his left, is Bill Bushey, one of the co-founders of Open Twin Cities. And what program did you graduate from again?
The MS of Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy at the Huffman.
Cool. And so Open Twin Cities hosts monthly reading groups, monthly meetups, and things like that around these questions, and organize hackathons and things like that. They'll tell you more about that as well. Amy Springer is our government documents librarian at the University of Minnesota Library. She's in the basement of Wilson. We used to be office mates. Then I fled. And I fled upstairs. But she is a wonderful resource in providing access to documents. And I wanted her perspective as this kind of historical perspective of government documents and bringing that to here as well. And finally, Kristen Murray is from CURA, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. And she's involved in leading a program called CURA Tech, which is a social civic technology incubator. So, with that, I will give it over to Alex.
What do you want me to do?
Sorry, thank you. So, stand here and look pretty.
That's what I was supposed to do.
Talk about where your work is in this area. Maybe some of your background, how you got into this, but the work you're doing right now that is in this way.
Sure. I got started looking into open data, actually, to step way back. I used to be a programmer for the College of Liberal Arts when I was an undergraduate student here. And I gave that up, and I decided at some point that I was going to take all technology references off of my resume because I was sick of working for nonprofit organizations and having them say, wait, you do web development? We need you. And then having to do web development, what I really wanted to do was work with people. And so for a long time, I sort of repressed the interest in myself in technology, and recently sort of rediscovered that this interest of mine will not stay repressed forever, and in fact was kind of holding back a part of me that I really value and enjoy. So I think the journey to rediscovery of that was starting to work on research around a gang assessment and trying to understand the prevalence of youth involvement in gangs, and going to law enforcement agencies and asking them for data about youth gang involvement and finding nothing but a blank wall and people who were very upset that you had called them and asked them for information. So I started to wonder if people were working on this issue and started searching around the internet and found out that in fact loads of people were working on this issue all over the world. And it was called Open Government and Open Data. And it was a big movement that people were taking part of. And so through searching for that, I found Open Twin Cities, I found a lot of other activism that's going on locally, and then a lot of other activism that's going on around the world. And I have an interest that cannot be contained, or a curiosity that cannot be contained. So I started to get involved in a couple of different projects, but quickly realized that what I really wanted to do was find out and give people access to what was going on all over the world in really amazing ways already. So I came up with this idea of starting a podcast and interviewing people who are doing work in what this broader field I think of as open knowledge, that includes open data and open government, and also open source software, and a whole lot of other like open things, open access, and open science and all that. And just decided that I was going to start interviewing people and talking to them and asking them about what they were doing, and really trying to make it accessible to the people that I work with on an everyday basis, who are mostly young people who don't have a lot of connection to technology, or a lot of like very active connection to technology where they feel very knowledgeable and very empowered to use it. And social service people who also feel very disempowered around technology most of the time, and when you start to talk about anything technical, get blank stares on their faces, and then after you finish talking, go, yeah, that sounds really interesting, and then that's the end of the conversation. So I really wanted to take all this stuff that can be really technical and engineering focused and make it really accessible to a broader population of people and invite more people into the conversation. And that's how I ended up starting the Open Knowledge Cast in January, and have interviewed something close to 50 people now about the projects that they do and the work that they are up to in the world, and how people can be a part of the work that they're doing, and have started to be part of a group of folks in the open knowledge community who are producing media and scholarship about what's happening around open knowledge, and trying to invite people into the conversation in a bigger way.
So yeah, I'm Bill Bushey. I guess since Alex started off with the like stepping back in our personal exploration, I'll go there too, because I started off, I think, very much going down a traditional software engineer career path. My undergrad was computer science, and I'd kind of gone and done co-ops and internships with companies like IBM, and I kind of graduated feeling like I definitely have an interest in computing, and an interest in engineering, but also kind of feeling like there's more. There's any given problem that you're trying to solve via technology is not just a technology problem. There are other aspects of the problem, and so that's kind of what led me to go to the Humphrey School to get a policy degree. And then I graduated from the Humphrey School and basically thought, oh crap, what do I do? Because even though, like, on the surface, everybody I talked to, they would say, oh yeah, I could see there being a lot to do with policy and computing technology. But then when you would try and find jobs, especially in Minnesota, there wasn't really anything there. So about that time, Alan Palazzolo and I met each other. He had been a Code for America fellow in 2011, I believe, and it was moving back to the cities. And he and I both were kind of started getting interested in this idea of, yeah, there are these things called brigades, called Code for America brigades popping up around the country. There are these organic, self-organizing groups, mostly of technologists who want to be exploring how to use computing technology or information technology for important local issues. And so we thought, I wonder if we could start that here. Neither of us really being community organizers. We both are technologists primarily. We just kind of thought, well, we don't know what we're doing, but we'll see if anybody's interested. And it's turned out that yes, people are interested. It's 2 years later, and it's depending on how you measure it. There's like 300 to 500 people, I think, within the community in the Twin Cities, and I feel like it can continue to grow. And so I guess now it's primarily actually about what can we do to support this community to do what it wants to do. And so, as Justin mentioned, that actually involves a lot of holding events, either regular monthly meetups or larger events, what we call hackathons, or maybe jams, codeathons, which really become a nice way to get everybody together, focus a bit of time and energy on issues, either issues that the participants come to the event wanting to look at themselves, or increasingly community members basically say, we want to know what social service organizations in the Twin Cities need in terms of technology, or how they want to be using technology in new, different ways. So we're actually looking more at involving organizations in the programming to then actually inform some of what gets done at these hackathons. And also they're a great way to further build the community. So, that's me.
All right. I'm Amy Springer, and as Justin said, I work here at the university in the libraries. I'm a government documents librarian, but I'm also the liaison for psychology and child development. But with my government hat on, I should explain that we're the regional library here for Minnesota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. So we have the most comprehensive federal government documents collection. So I have to have a lot of familiarity with how to access the print, what's been digitized by us and other institutions, and then familiarity with how to retrieve information from government websites, international, national, state, city, etc. I'm also on a board with Bill called MNCOGI, Minnesota Coalition on Government Information. And I feel like I've been on the board for a year now, I believe. And that's kind of changed the way I look at openness in government. And the majority of the people on this board are journalists. So it's been interesting to see their perspective too. It's not just librarians who need access to government information. There's these other people who need access. I'm also personally interested in FOIA and sunshine laws, and how we can get our patrons access to information, or if we have a stumper reference question with government information, it's like, well, why doesn't that exist, or does it, and who owns it, and what's restricting access? And I also wanted to mention that when I took this job, I read a book called Open Government, Collaboration, Transparency, and Participation in Practice, and it's from 2010, so it's a bit old now, but it'd be great if you're a beginner to this topic, because there's lots of chapters on different reasons why information isn't open, and there was a chapter on why people with technology backgrounds choose not to work for the government, and give suggestions on how we can change this to improve our websites and to improve interaction from citizens. So I just want to mention that book.
I'm Kristen Murray, and I work here at the university at CURA, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, like Justin mentioned. I started there when I was a graduate student. I was getting a master's in urban design, landscape architecture, and public policy, and was working on with the community GIS group, so doing technical assistance around spatial mapping, data analysis, visualization. My earlier degree is in engineering, and so I am very much about kind of making things, how things are made, solving problems, and both in kind of a sciencey way, but also interested in more of an artful, like what art can do. I guess that's a kind of two lenses that I try to look through depending on the situation. And I got into the civic tech work through that community GIS work and through design work, urban design work. And over the last year and a half or so, have been working out of CURA to develop this civic technology incubator, which has been a really wonderful process and learning experience, I'll just own to, that we've been engaged in. So yeah, just to highlight, so in an incubator, not so much in terms of a physical space kind of business incubator idea, but more of a process that people who are engaged are going through to develop, to take an issue or a need that they've identified in the community that technology can help address, and then follow that through to developing a prototype and a more robust beta version. And just, some of the highlights, I think, of things that we've learned or ways that we've framed this project, really based on what we've heard from the community, from longtime community-based organizations that CURA has partnered with over the last many years, are these. So one, partly because it wasn't so available in, well, let me back up. So we didn't start with data with the Civic Technology Incubator. It wasn't, this project wasn't kind of instigated by this big opening up of, dozens or hundreds of public data sets. That hadn't happened yet at the city level or the state level. So instead, and I think this was a good thing, it started with this question: how can technology strengthen their community? And then you can back into the need for data out of that question. The second thing that we heard from our community partners, and I think is important, is when it comes to civic technology, is that civic technology isn't always digital. It's not always high-tech, fancy data visualizations and apps and things like that, but it can also be low-tech solutions too. I mean, it can be, felt boards, and it can be printed out materials that are information-based, that convey a story or solve a problem, perhaps better than a high-tech digital solution does. Third, it's really worth it to use a design process when you're working on civic technology projects, to think about what need is this addressing, to iterate, to prototype, to get it in front of people who are going to be using the thing that you're making. And finally, that it's also really worth asking the question, who benefits from the things that you're making. With CURA Tech, we wanted to explicitly ask this question and explicitly create a project and support projects that benefit low-income communities and communities of color, because we were seeing that question not be asked at the kind of national level when it comes to civic technology and open data, and so we wanted to be explicit about that. So some of the projects that have come out of CURA Tech do leverage public data and open data, and some of them are more about pulling together other kinds of information that the community holds, knowledge that sits in not so much in a public agency, but sits in the community. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, everybody. So we wanted to start with this question and have you, each of you answer it, discuss it, adjust your chairs if need be. And I think it gets a lot of different aspects of what you have talked about, and a lot of the different possibilities for this. So I know Alex has already drawn some things for us. Before he got here, can't help himself. So how might we critically leverage the potential of data gathering, analysis, and visualization tools to improve a community's sense of the challenges, risks, and opportunities facing them? I'll hand it over to you guys.
Can I just ask you a question first? Do we need to say what open data and civic technology are in some way, or do people feel like this is a good basis that we already have? Okay. I'm like I know that we can, I enter into spaces a lot where those are assumed terms, and I just don't want to make them assumed terms. I think everyone probably has different definitions of these, so I'll just throw out mine really quick. I think that open data has been like a movement to take data which is already public in some way, so the government has designated it as data which the public as a whole should have access to, and to make it available, technically available, so in easy formats, to make it accessible for free online so that it's quick to access and anyone can get it, and to make it well documented so that people can see what's there and that they can make sense of it. There's a lot of really good definitions of open data that are out there, but if people want to add to that. Do you want to say, Amy, what open government is?
Oh, putting me on the spot here. Open government, I wish I had my book that I really like here. Open government is about access to information, basically what you said about open data. It's about following the laws, have an understanding of the laws that where they indicate what needs to be open.
I think the movement for open government has also been about pushing governments to be more open to citizens participating in various government processes and about making various government processes more open to citizens too, right?
Collaborate, yeah, participating, collaborating. One thing I would add to your definition about open data is it's very government-centric, and the concept of open data can apply to non-governmental organizations. I was about to say the university, but the university is a governmental organization. But academia in general, for example, through the open science movement, can be putting out open data, or nonprofits or businesses can be also freely making available data that might be of use to individuals or for social causes.
Civic tech.
Oh, right. Yeah, so I've been doing this for a couple of years. I'm still not entirely sure what actually constitutes civic tech. I'd be interested to hear your take, Kristen. I guess coming from generally like a grassroots perspective, I think it's often technology that somehow mediates a resident's ability to either interact with the social institutions that are in their community, and that could be government, or it could be non-governmental organizations that provide various kinds of services, social services, infrastructural services, or also technology that empowers people to somehow change the community that they're in a way that just better reflects what they need, what they want, and generally it has some kind of, the demand comes bottom up. So the people, kind of going in with this open government thing, the residents help define, possibly help design, help build the technology in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I would agree with that. I think, Code for America fellows who are working within local governments, regional governments, I think even though they're not necessarily residents, maybe they're still, I'm just thinking about if it's always bottom up, if it's always residents, if it's always grassroots. I think governments can develop civic technologies as well. So.
I agree with that.
It's interesting. I just think of two of the
certainly nonprofits.
Two of the projects that were in the first round of the CURA Tech incubation period. The project, which neighborhood is it?
Cleveland
neighborhood project, which is making videos, doing interviews with people about issues that they're not seeing on city council meetings and things like that, and taking this very grassroots neighborhood-based approach. And another project, which was building on API for the system that is that the city government, Minneapolis city government, is using for their city council meetings, and that you can pull and develop this whole dashboard around this stuff. And when I talked to one of the developers afterwards, like, you're pulling from all these things, and you're able to set alerts and notifications and things for what's on the city council, but what's the method for getting things that aren't on the agenda? And so being able to connect those two projects together, so it doesn't have to be this large scale kind of thing people are talking about. It doesn't have to be data, it doesn't have to be this or this or this. It can be whiteboards, but a lot of it is that community centric focus as well. Anything else you guys want to add?
Well, when you sent us this question, the first thing that came to my mind is the issue of privacy. And I think that we have an opportunity to teach people that, I think people think of privacy and open government as like enemies. At least that's come up in conversations I've had with people about, we need to have open access to government information. And they're like, no, not our personnel records. It's like, no, the law protects us from things like that. So really teaching people about the law and the protections that are in place for our privacy. Otherwise, some people tend to be very anti-open.
I think, to add on to that, I believe it's Estonia actually has like one of the best implementations of government technology. Like you get a government you get a national ID card, and you can do all kinds of things with that. Like you can, it sounds like you enthusiastically nodded, so maybe
I
you
just
can
read a
actually,
paper that someone wrote about this, that's all.
like you can pay for things with it. It's like your mass transit thing. It's how you can vote with it. Like you can vote with it online, and like you can do a lot of things that in the United States seem like, well, this is the future. Like 30 years from now, this will be what we can do in the United States. And like I started investigating that more, and I think Estonia has been able to build that. And granted, Estonia is much smaller. It's a very different country. But I think part of the reason they were able to build that is there's generally a much stronger, I think, regulation of privacy in Estonia, such that I think it actually gives citizens much stronger trust in government. They're much more willing to give government information because they feel a pretty good assurance that it will not be misused or won't be used in a way that they did not anticipate it being used.
I also think about questions of the voter. My home state of Wisconsin, all the back and forth with the voter ID laws, and I'm wondering does everybody have access to that in Estonia? I mean, what about immigrant populations or things like that? And so is there a differential access to that kind of thing? So,
Did you want us to talk about this question in more depth?
I just have a question about open data. So far, a lot of it has been talking about open government data. Is there a similar movement about open data from corporations or private holdings?
Yes, but it's more disparate, and it's kind of, every so often these major corporations are releasing like data sets that they've accumulated, but it's kind of at their will, and in my opinion anyway, at their will, and when it serves their business interests. It's kind of whenever they'll do it. There's a great group though that's called Open Corporates that's been doing a ton of work to scrape, which means just to go to like whatever websites that are available online and to pull data from it and to kind of crunch it and turn it into good machine readable data that you can build applications on top of. And they've done it for like millions of corporate web pages. So they've gathered all this data that's not really open and made it open. And actually I did an interview with a person named Greg Bloom who works on a project called Open Referrals, and they are doing stuff with nonprofits and trying to figure out how do we, as nonprofit and social service agencies, have communication with each other around what sorts of services we offer in order to make proper referrals and helpful referrals across organizations. And so in that interview, it's really interesting to talk to him about the complexities of trying to build these communications across groups, whereas I think a lot of the government data stuff, the conversations are more, it's more about like, we have this data set already, how do we turn it into something that's readable, and how do we make it actually open, and do we want to? And then you bump into the same sorts of problems around privacy. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there are some, but it's a lot. The government stuff has been happening for a really long time. Minkogi, I think, has been around for a while, right? So like that stuff's been happening for a while. This other stuff is kind of new, at least in my knowledge.
Yeah, I feel like open data in the government space is kind of about modernizing an idea that's already been around for a few generations. Like FOIA and the Data Practices Act have been around since the 60s and 70s. And so there's already kind of a culture and a legal infrastructure there to accessing government data versus private holders. Like there's no legal need for them to release this information outside of specific cases. And I think in many cases there's a cultural almost bias against private parties releasing that information.
And then to tie government back again to corporate entities, we also have the problem with different layers of government using like proprietary software, and then it's difficult for us to access it because for whatever reason they can't release data or records because it's trapped in these proprietary layers.
For example, the city of Minneapolis Police Department has signed a contract with an organization called Bear Analytics, which puts all of their data, which is public data and belongs to us, into a private system that we no longer have access to, that we can only see in the visualizations they produce for us. So as private citizens living in the world, trying to make sense of what our police force is doing, we actually have very limited ability to do our own analytics on the data that's there, which is an interesting.
Are those FOIA protected though?
Well, FOIA is national,
Right.
so
Oh,
it'd be
okay,
the
so it doesn't apply
Minnesota
to
data
local.
practices and privacy.
Yeah.
But it's complicated because from my understanding of the law, there's so much wiggle room. Like you're allowed, similar to libraries, to be able to set rules on how often you dump information. So I know that's an issue right now with body cams. I can't remember the time period, but they're not keeping the body cam videos forever. They're allowed to dump them after a period of time if there's no legal situation with the videos. So there's all sorts of problems with it.
Yeah, and I think specifically with the bear, the data from the city of Minneapolis for bear, I don't see any particular reason why we would not be able to request that data, because we know it exists. And it's, assuming it's been aggregated to protect privacy, to be able to deliver to this company, which I assume it is, there's really not a solid argument to be made against a DPA request for that I can think of.
But that needs to be written in the contracts. I think, wish we had a representative from iPad up here who could kind of, does everyone know what iPad is? I'm blanking on the acronym right now.
Information Policy Advisory Division?
Yeah, so it's a part of the Minnesota state government, and when somebody's having difficulty accessing anything, I'm trying to think of a good example. So when a principal gets fired and receives a big chunk of money and nobody knows why they were terminated, sometimes you can go through iPad and they can help you get access to the information. Now I lost my train of thought. Where was I going with this?
I think figuring out if the bear's data is, whether the contract with this between the city and the company.
So I think iPad should or could be involved in helping with those contracts, because we need access. So don't sign anything with the company unless you know you can retrieve.
And maybe we can use this as a kind of maybe case study. Like, you know, if you had this data, what data is it collecting? What could you do with it? What could someone other do with this data?
So I know some of the suggestions I've heard. So I should say actually alongside Open Twin Cities, I've also been working for eDemocracy, which is a nonprofit that helps provide discussion spaces for neighborhoods. And so kind of through this, I've heard some of the people who participate in those forums talk about, we organize nightly or regular walks around the neighborhood. And if we can get information that there's like a rash of car break-ins happening on a particular street, well, we can go walk down that street and just essentially act as a deterrent and also just look out for things. It's kind of an informal way of getting citizens involved in watching out for crime in their neighborhoods. So I think that's like kind of a proactive citizen engagement method. I think there's also the watching, oversight of police. If you can look at this information and see certain parts of town seem to have much higher arrest rates for various types of crimes, and you can start to investigate that question of why is that? That's just a great question, great place to start. Why is that? You can start that discussion with police or with the city, and I think that discussion is more difficult to get started if you don't have that data to look at.
Or there's a group that's in, building off of what you just said, Bill, there's a group that's in, I think, New York that does work, I think they're the Justice Mapping Project or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they do work to map. They've reversed it. Instead of mapping where crime is happening, they're mapping incarceration rates for neighborhoods. So they're saying how much earnings potential and the potential for like whole families is being taken out of these neighborhoods by the ways that we're policing them and who we're choosing to arrest and for what. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, on the side of like working toward social justice to say that this data would give us the ability to come up with hard numbers to go to these government agencies or as communities to respond to problems that are happening in our communities and say, hey, look, we've got the numbers, we know what's going on, and we're really curious what your response is to this. And that's the kind of stuff that's really not possible with the technology, the way that the contracts were written and how it's been laid out so far, at least as far as I know.
I think you bumped too into equity around information and who knows what's available and how do you find out what's available? How do you have access to finding out what's available? How much, a lot of times you get into these cycles with people who hold information about, well, what do you have information about this or data about this? Well, what do you want to know? And you're kind of in this loop of, well, I want to see what you might have so that I can find out what questions I might have if I know, and you end up in these loops. And then I think the other thing that is problematic, especially about crime, is we kind of fixate on this one kind of crime, right? And there are lots of kinds of crimes that are perpetrated against our communities, and we don't map those in the same way as we don't put the same focus on kind of accessing that data in a way that we can visualize it, map it, as we do on this other kind of crime.
You can hear of like the environmental justice atlas.
Yeah, environmental justice, banking, all kinds of things. CURA has partnered with the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, or SEED, over the last few years to kind of help on the technical assistance side with a project that they've been envisioning and leading, the Environmental Justice Atlas. And so there's all these different data layers, all public data that you can layer in, stuff from the MPCA, from the city, the county, and then census demographic data. And we presented this at a community event back in January, and it was really great because people started calling out other data sources that they'd like to see included in this environmental justice map. Things around mental health and mental illness, homelessness, police brutality, things like that. And a number, some of the things that people wanted to see on the map are things that we can find a data source for, but some of them aren't. There's just not, that data's not collected. We don't put energy in, we don't make it a priority, I guess, or it's a privacy issue, and so though we could map some stuff around health, but it's at such a large geography that it wouldn't necessarily be at a resolution that would work with this map. So, but yeah, I think something I've learned is just, and I think this kind of ties into design too, is just having something that you can, kind of going back to that question, having a visualization that you use not as the endpoint, not as like, this is the answer, this is fact, or this is reality, but it's a conversation point. It's what's missing from this, how else would you label this? Is this, what questions does this make you ask? And using it as a conversation, not as a kind of, ta-da, this is it. It can be useful.
Any other questions or comments from the audience?
So there's no like embezzling or fraud map or
I've
anything
never
like
That's
that?
part of the
If you're
trouble.
gonna catch somebody, you just what you were saying, I don't think you were addressing this, but it just is somebody has weed in their pocket or heroin or something, I can see that on Trulia or whatever, right, if they got arrested there. But if somebody were to embezzle $1 million, it doesn't show me on the map where they necessarily lived.
Especially if we never
so
convict them.
Or if it's
certain
a
kinds of
corporation,
crimes
if
or
it's
arrests
Right.
are,
Yes.
certain arrests are very visible, but other arrests are not quite as visible.
That's the problem with making these maps in the first place, is that you end up mapping what ends up being like low-income crimes, right? And so then you miss all of the crime that happens And then you get people looking at them to say, like, hey, where do I want to live when I move somewhere?
Exactly.
And this is the people who have the privilege of deciding where they want to live in the first place. But when they do, then they're looking at these maps and they're saying, where do I want to live? And I'm like, do I want to live next to the guy who got picked up off the street for having a bag of weed in his pocket? Or do I want to live next to the guy who just embezzled $1 million out of all the people around me? Well, it's like pretty clear to me, but there's only one that shows up on that map, unless we convicted the other person.
Amy, were you?
Yeah, I was just curious. I mean, apart from the embezzling, which I think really, Scott, you would just have like a big black dot over Wall Street.
Well, no, and I'm purposely not trying to propagandize this. I'm just pointing that
No,
out.
that's just the
Their
application.
statement is that certain things are not being visible through this.
But a question I do have that I'm curious about is if you found that particular kinds of arguments are effective when working with people who don't want to release data. So sticking with the police, I mean, if one is a police officer, there are all kinds of reasons why you don't want to make this available. It doesn't really matter what the law is. If you're disinclined to do so to begin with, you're going to look for ways to not do it. And even if you're not, consciously thinking to yourself, I would like to find ways to avoid fulfilling my responsibility. And so I'm curious, when you're trying to talk someone away from that position, are there things that seem to be more effective in working with them, or is it entirely unique to each situation?
I need to think of like how many times have we actually talked to.
Perhaps it hasn't come up.
No, I mean, so Kristen and I were actually involved with the working group for the Minneapolis Open Data Policy. So we did end up talking to a few different departments. I think both from that experience and also looking at what others have reported nationally, I think focusing on the data as a foundation of community engagement, community connection, is a pretty good argument, because I think most government entities have in their charge somehow to work for the community, to work with the community, including police, and I think often some of the most successful government initiatives have significant community involvement, and so I think talking about open data as a way of saying this is a way to show residents what's going on, to humanize the government, to show people that you're doing the best you can, or to kind of open up and say, this is an area we are looking for advice on, or an area maybe we are struggling with, if you're willing to publicly state you're struggling on something. And I think that's a way to get people invested. And it's also a way to kind of reframe discussions. Instead of being us versus them, it's like us working together.
I think pointing out success stories too. I remember reading something about the new Minneapolis council member who's doing cool things. Is it Andrew Johnson? And he was quoted in an article talking about cool things that Chicago has done. So look, the current setup is really holding us back from doing these really neat initiatives that other communities are doing. And then I know it's come up recently, cameras in the courts, and lots of states have cameras in the courts, and they're doing just fine. And but at the same time, there's a lot of arguments against Minnesota going in that direction. So just comparing to other states or communities, I think, will help.
If you're looking at government data, specifically the Sunlight Foundation in DC is a wonderful infrastructural anchor for open data, government open data around the country. And they have folks there who work on local and state government data policy, and they're wonderful resources because they know all the communities around the country who have managed to get open data, or data opened up rather, and the processes that they use, and they can put you in contact with them. They're phenomenal.
There's also $1 trillion. According to the McKinsey Group, they figure there's at least $1 trillion of economic opportunity in open data in the United States. It's a very broad definition of open data they took, but still, if you go to a government and say there's a $1 trillion pie in the U.S., that'll get people's attention.
Well, I was wondering about that incident with firearm ownership. And I don't remember where, I think it was somewhere out east.
New York,
New York.
And they had to pull it because I don't know if it was an invasion of privacy or just politically unacceptable to have a map showing firearm ownership. I'd love to know that. I'd love to see those kind of maps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to remember like the resolution there. Why did they pull it? Was it something in the law?
I think it might have been considered an invasion of privacy.
I loosely remember
Bicycle ownership, would that be an invasion of privacy? Or other ownership, car ownership? Anything that's licensed, right? Regulated.
Well, it looks like this one also is publishing names and addresses of gun permit holders.
Yeah, that's New Jersey, right?
And I think that was kind of an activist attempt after some of the shootings.
The newspaper reported that, and then people got up in arms over the newspaper reporting and went after the newspaper reporters.
Right.
Addresses.
I think if it's a way of not localizing it, I mean, the names and addresses is one thing, but localizing it around a certain neighborhood area, and making it stopping at one level up from there, perhaps. And then I think you're still getting the point. It's a way of that without necessarily. I mean, you're probably not going after each one of those individuals who have a gun. You're looking at the aggregate. So.
Do you think a Sandy Hook publication defeats sort of when you do something that provocative because you can, do you think that's pushing the boundaries kind of defeats some of the other kinds of movements towards things that are maybe a little bit more low-hanging fruit, or do you think that how you use that data is a good idea? I'm asking your personal opinion because we have these policy discussions within libraries all the time about whether, on open access and other kinds of publishing and other kinds of discussions.
I'd bring it back to the argument of open versus privacy. And some people feel very, very strongly about privacy and would have big issues with the gun ownership mapping. So that's just so polarizing. I don't know if we want to.
And it was done with the knowledge that this would be polarizing. It was almost done as a social activist or as a clickbait or something, from my understanding.
But when violence due to guns becomes a public health problem, that's when these visualization tools have to help us say, wow, here's ownership of handguns at this concentration, and here's the deaths by handguns, or whatever we need to do when we perceive something as a public health problem.
Yes.
That's where I'd like to.
Level?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm just going back to Justin. Like, at what level? The neighborhood, the blocks, or the individual home. That's going to turn a lot of people off to open data, open records.
I think one thing, privacy is a socially constructed concept, and it's always evolving. And so I think one thing, with like the gun ownership map, one thing I think it definitely brings up is an opportunity to gauge, is this something that society in general feels should be private? And I feel like I don't quite remember that, but I don't remember seeing a lot of discussion about whether or not this should be public. It was almost there was a much stronger discussion around, no, this shouldn't have been public to begin with. So it's like, in that case, I think it's pretty clear, if I own a firearm, that's something I can keep private. Which I think then at least kind of checks off something. Like, okay, we know that's something that society still considers to be a private piece of information.
Or we need to adjust our level at which we either gather data or display data.
Yeah.
And I come at it from a different angle than privacy. I think the privacy conversation is an interesting one. I always come back to Kristen's question at the beginning, who's benefiting from this? And I'm all for, I'm not ideologically committed to open data as something we all ought to push. I think it's great. when it works on behalf of the people who haven't had power and money and resources and access. And I don't really care about it if that's not what it's about. So I stand like really differently than a lot of folks in the community. And I think one of the things that the activist work does is it becomes a problem because it's going after the people who have power and money and privilege, and that's the reason it gets beat up all over the place, right? And then we turn back to conversations about privacy. I'd love to see us keep pushing on this stuff with whatever data we can get access to, because to me it's about questioning and pushing back against the people who have money. And I think the problem with open data and the $1 trillion of economic privilege that goes, or the economic power that goes into it, the reason I drew this was because what I see happening is there's a number of producers of data, a relatively small number, and I think activists have been working to open doors into the data that's getting produced for a long time, and that's the open government people, but now it's open source and open data and open access and all of that stuff, and I think that's great. And they're trying to open doors to the data and the knowledge that's there. And but mainly what's happening is that the doors are getting opened, and they're saying, please come. And the problem is the people who are coming in are primarily experts who have the knowledge and the ability to get at this stuff and to use it, which are not most of us, and people who have crap loads of money and can leverage it for more money. And I am not, I stand very differently, and I will acknowledge that, from a lot of the open knowledge community on this stuff, because I don't believe we should help this. And I think this is primarily because these are the folks who already know how to do it, primarily the folks who are getting access. What I would really love to see, and I do youth participatory action research, and this is the reason why, is I'd love to see this group of people who are consuming knowledge move into the group of people that's producing knowledge. And right now, I don't see that happening a lot. I see the doors opened, inviting people into that, but I don't see us making a lot of effort to bring people into here. And I'm glad to be sitting on the panel with these folks, because I think they are the people who are doing this kind of work. But I think mostly what's happening is that we're really laudatory of a lot of people who are opening doors to what's been produced without really thinking about what is coming back to folks, which is not all that much for most people in the world, or with how we're inviting people from this big pie of folks who are consuming the knowledge that's produced into the group of people who are producing knowledge. So for me, that question is like, I just fall out really differently on that. I'm all for like, if less data is opened as a result, I'd still like to see us using what we get to push back against the people who have power and money.
Open data means open for all, right?
But it doesn't. Like, open data right now means open for people who can.
But that's a risk, I guess.
That's the huge risk. And I think that the problem is like, right now, if those doors are open and those people take most of it, it's still there for us, but I don't know if we'll ever catch up, like if everyday people will ever catch up.
No, but and what I was saying before, thinking strategically, if the people who might not have done, these are journalists, so they would have used data anyways, but if folks who are more social activists, for example, use data to move their points forward, which makes a lot of sense, but that in fact roils the consumers who then advocate for more stricter kinds of data, says they actually help the experts and the people who make money close the door anymore. So what I'm hearing you say is that's the strategic risk. Well, that's fine.
Yeah, I think it's a question of strategy there. And
right.
Maybe it's difference of nuance between which particular activist project you're taking on.
What you're saying, Scott, reminds me a lot of a training session that I went to from the Minnesota Population Center. It was an NHGIS, National Historic GIS. And to create an account for NHGIS, it's free, but you are agreeing to use the data for good, not evil. And I just...
Does it literally say good, not evil?
Yes, but I just it stuck with me. I mean, this was probably like a year ago. Like, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Because I think Van and I are disagreeing about the gun situation. Like, what one person thinks is good, another person doesn't. And
that's right.
So who determines that? And maybe the future of this topic is more about the ethical use. I'm not sure what the library's role would be in that. It's one of our information literacy standards.
Well, I don't think I really I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. I don't know if I'm qualified to like have a good opinion on this, but I do sometimes think of what's the relationship between open data and free speech in the United States. Because free speech is very protected, and there's like hundreds of years of case law around that, and I feel like that it feels like there's a lot of connection between data, the releasing of data, the use of data, and free speech, but I haven't yet really seen it like. I haven't seen discussions of open data framed in a free speech frame.
Nancy, where are you? Or copyright IP librarian Nancy Simpson. Yeah, just invoke her. Yeah, just thinking about that question of the ethics of data, and I think Alex will let you point out, like, we may not even in some cases be there yet. I mean, we are there to talk about it in certain ways, but like there's got to be, I feel like a larger mass of folks engaging with data or being discussed with on this wider level with data team, and start having those conversations. So it's not just like different experts talking about ethics. Something there was a student who emailed me about wanting to mine Yelp's data with API, and thinking about this kind of middle ground is going back to the corporations, but where they say, their business interests and they want to have access to people's things, but a lot of this is still advertising for them in some way, even though they're opening this up to it, they're still controlling their kind of access. So there is a sense of, this is another illustration of this, that there's the skills to do this, the access to do this, but it's not working in some other way, and if it starts to turn against them, they're going to shut it down.
One thing I'm wondering about is what y'all would consider to be the appropriate skills that you'd want to see outside of an expert context. I mean, just imparting basic data literacy can be a time-intensive and complex concept by itself, let alone understanding what people are looking at. So what you would expect maybe from different groups would be interesting to know. And how you get that across as well.
I guess I want to answer that, but I also want to take a step back and go back to Alex's diagram for a second, because I've just been thinking about, I'm like right on what you're saying, and then also, I don't know if it's like the data's over here, and then there's everybody else necessarily. I went to this conference last spring, and somebody said something that I really liked, which that data is like radioactivity. It's all around us. It's just powerful when you collect it, right? And that's when it gets powerful. That's cool. So so it's all around us. It's not just, it's maybe collected more over here, but it's still all around us. And so it almost feels like it's a question of organizing and power. And so, hey, these guys have power because the data is organized and collected and together. But there might be there's data everywhere, and everybody else, if maybe you're interested in this data, maybe not, maybe there's other questions or other needs or other knowledge, other information. And so then it's a question of how do you organize people and data information together. So I almost feel like, I don't know, it's like I guess I'm not quite sure that it's a thing of like, let me train you about how to make sense of this data or how to read this visualization, or it's more of like let's do it together. It's more of a let's do it together and be a team. I guess that's how I'm seeing it more. And the visualization is only as good as it is legible to somebody. So I feel like it's not when I make stuff, it's not sort of like, here, if you can't make sense of this, then I need to train you how to make sense of it, but it's more like, how can I redesign it so that it works, and what do I need to understand better to make the context work so that it's legible?
So you're describing research methods then?
Maybe so. I don't know. Like, so I feel like, I don't know if I do research, so more visualization design / yeah.
Going off.
No.
It's more than just having data. I mean,
Right.
you have to have a way to use it.
Right.
And I think often that's where, an open data program is just not going to have, and it has to address somebody who has a plan. and if it just opens the data, that the people who have plans, and I think you're right, they're going to come in, they're going to use it to their advantage. But if you really want to empower a certain group, you have to equip them with tactics and strategies and contacts and a whole bunch of stuff before they can make use of the open data in a really useful way.
I totally agree with both of you. I think it's about the community organizing work that we're doing. I think there's a scholar in London named Alison Powell, who I just interviewed on the podcast, and one of the things that she said that I really loved is she distinguishes between geek publics and community publics. And I think it's a really important distinction for those especially involved in civic technology, that the civic technologists, I think, are oftentimes on like the side of good in this too, and they're trying to give access to people who wouldn't have access otherwise to a lot of this data. And one of the challenges, though, is that it ends up getting organized around technical problems or like technical interests. And so she describes like a geek public as a very limited definition of a public group of people. And one of the things that we need to do is like, can we reach out and build a bigger public? And can we build it around what does, like, I think, Bill, you mentioned this at the beginning, like, what does the public need? And then how are we leveraging these tools that are available to us and this data that's available to us to make these kinds of needs happen? That's how I see like the flip of the tools piece is, and how do we get people to know the data piece is more like how do we do the organizing together piece, and then how do we get the right people in the room so that we can use the capacities that we have toward change.
Yeah, I feel like just going off of that, reiterating the ability, almost like communication skills, just being able to get a message out, because we live in an era of way too much information. I mean, even before the internet, when we lived in the era of cable television, too much information, and it's like everybody's trying to get your attention, and so you're not, more than likely, you're not going to get somebody to support your cause by showing them a graph. Maybe you will, but I think often there are other communication methods that will often be more successful, and you'll use the data to inform how that's executed or to what end that's executed. I will also just put in a plug. I feel like there should be computer science education in high school and middle school. Not because I necessarily want the world to be all programmers, but because I think it's a legitimately important literacy in the 21st century to be able to conceptualize what data is, how algorithms work, that these are very malleable, that technology is very malleable, and so you can look at a visualization, or you can look at a piece of software and say, I don't think that's right. I don't necessarily know how I would make it better, but I know it can be made better.
And that's the piece about who becomes producers in this too. I think that the computer literacy and the data literacy stuff is important, but also like those visualizations that we're producing, a lot of what's happening is that these visualizations are getting produced by a very small group of people, and then we're trying to communicate them to this large consumer base. And there is the piece of capacity building in here that's like, who can come in and how can we all become part of generating knowledge about our own lives instead of waiting for people to generate knowledge about us. And I think that is a big education project. It's a big community organizing project. But it's also an essential project, because if we don't do it, now the corporations that have a lot of money are going to be the ones that they're already the ones doing it. Google and Facebook and all these companies that have so much data about us know more about us than we sometimes know about ourselves. And that's really dangerous.
I wanted to kind of go back to what Kristen and Alex were talking about, particularly in regards to what makes open data ethical. When is it used for good and when is it used for evil? And it seems to me that a big part of what can make open data ethical is the ability to put that data in a usable context that is dynamic and can be changed by the consumer of the information, because that really empowers the person that's looking at the data, and in a sense makes them part of that producer group. So for instance, I was thinking about the gun data visualization, gun ownership. That data visualization was rather static. Having the ability to put that information in various other contexts, by the consumers that are looking at it, to me, that's what would make that ethical versus not. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think there's, two thoughts that kind of came to mind. One is earlier this year, when we had all that ice in about March, I think, covering all the storm drains, and the Pioneer Press was trying to get the storm drain location from the cities, and eventually did. You then had residents basically saying, well, the map's wrong. Like, you're telling me there's storm drain here when there isn't. It would be useful. It'd be useful for both parties, for the resident to be able to submit that correction. And like that seems like kind of a mundane example, but I feel like it's tangible of like how, again, citizens can work with their government to make the whole thing better. And also make citizens feel empowered that they can contribute to their community and that they can work with their government. What was the other thing I thought of?
the map of here's who didn't shovel in Minneapolis and got fined that came out earlier this week.
People get fined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these are down to. Yeah.
So I remember the other thing I was thinking of. I think something I sometimes see that it feels a little insidious is when an organization makes kind of a big deal about releasing data, or I think especially when they make a big deal about providing a new presentation of data that may seem on the surface to be pretty interactive, pretty useful. Like I see this with budget information sometimes, where a city will talk about, we're making our budget information available online, and you can go there and you can see like nice bar charts. It doesn't really tell me anything new. Like you made a lot of noise about this, but I'm not able to learn anything about this. And then I can go to other cities and I can see that they've created interactive websites with exploring the budget, and like you can actually drill down. You can find out who proposed things. What area, what is this money actually being used for? What bridge is being built? Where did the money come from? Like I said, who proposed it? And so it's like when I compare these two things, that's when I start to think like, well, you're using the name of open data falsely. And you're using it to kind of rally people around you, but then not actually really following through on the ideal.
And potentially limiting what people could imagine being the ideal too,
Yeah.
because you've said this look at all this cool, really incredible, amazing stuff. And when people go out there like, oh, this is cool, like this is cutting edge, and now we don't have any idea that there might be other things that might be more cutting edge or more possible because it's there. I think the danger in the visualization stuff, I think visualization is an amazing way to share things. One of the people I interviewed is at the World Bank Institute, Felipe Estefan, and he is doing data visualization produced with communities on whiteboards or on big board paper because they don't have computers around. And I think like the flashy, cool part of data visualization gets missed when people who would be able to do something with that information, who it really affects, can't access it. And I think a lot of these things that get produced for they're a broader but still small group of people. And the stuff that I want to see is like, how do we get this stuff produced by a lot more people in a lot more ways and a lot more broadly, so that it's not just everyone who has smartphones that gets to participate, but that it's a much bigger group of people.
I guess since we are at an institution of higher learning, we have the examples of Kristen project that we're doing this year. What is the role of the university in talking about some of these things and advocating for certain things, or by showing, by saying, or by doing.
I mean, I guess because I went to the Humphrey, that's mostly what I'm familiar with at the U. So I know the Humphrey School plays a pretty important part in, if not defining public discussion, at least convening and hosting it. And so I think to the extent that an institution like a public policy school can prompt that discussion in some way via holding events, via holding forums, or yeah, I mean, to me that would be useful. I think especially to talk about how it then relates to other aspects of public policy.
I'm thinking less about events and more about getting it in the curriculum too. Like,
Yeah.
what courses are required for certain majors? Is there anything about data literacy, data management, data everything? Ethical use?
Yeah, I think convening and teaching definitely, and convening and teaching definitely, and I think I can't even get my head around the university as like one body because it's so multifaceted, you know. But I've just over the last few years that I've been working at CURA, I've come to realize that we're in this unique position because we're trusted by, or we kind of sit between community organizations and people working at more of the grassroots level, and then public agencies and people who hold that public data and can be an intermediary. And some of that's changing, of course, as data is opened up. But I think, you know, continuing to partner with more of the folks working at the grassroots level to help, you know, to partner with them to find ways for that data to continue to find ways for that data to be useful, and then elevate what those ways are, whether, you know, whatever that looks like, if that's a visualization or a low-tech solution or a new kind of technology that's developed. That's another way. And to, continue to kind of be that bridge partner, community partner.
I was at a presentation earlier this today that had some academics reporting on their research study and emphasizing how little you could conclude from all the research they had done, because they were responsible academics. They realized that data is very difficult to interpret, and what happens when that runs up against a political agenda on a community's part or on the part of one of us? Where is the line between being an advocate and being a responsible academic bring us into tension?
That was like one of the core questions of the policy program I went through. I have no good answer for you. I don't know. Let me think about that for a minute.
I don't know where to fall out on that question. I mean, I think one of the things I tend to come at this from an activist lens, because I think I'm an activist first and a scholar second. I think when it comes to what role the university has in some of this stuff, I think in addition to these folks, like producing scholarship about these movements is important, in part to understand like how is data being used, this data that's becoming open being used, and I think universities are kind of in key positions to provide a critical eye on that and to take a little bit of the wind out of the sails of kind of this fetishization of technology and data visualization and data journalism and all this data without a whole lot of questions about like what data and how is it being used and how are we analyzing it and is it good and what are we really saying like when we put it all out there. And I think the second part of it though, and this is where the participatory research stuff comes in, is that we, I think, can move as universities from investing in research that is focused on getting all the numbers exactly right and reproducing all the numbers that are exactly right, to research that's in an epistemology, in a way of constructing knowledge, that thinks about like whose knowledge is this, and how are we constructing it, and Why does it matter? And what kind of power has been invested in creating the kind of knowledge analysis that we're doing, and the kind of power, especially behind quantitative, like number analysis. And we've invested a lot of power in that as a society. I think one of the things that researchers and universities can do is start to turn that ship a little bit and to say, I think what might be really important is, can people live good, full, wholesome, happy lives together? And can we use knowledge towards that end? And who needs to be producing knowledge in order to get us to that point? And can we get together in new, different ways that we haven't done before and produce new, different kinds of knowledge that help us get there? So I guess I'm less invested in like getting, that balance between getting the knowledge right or wrong or accurate or not. I'm interested in who's using it and how they're using it and the power that's kind of behind it, and especially when it comes to that positivistic scientific paradigm around data. I don't want to get too caught up in that personally. I think that's a route that we can go down, but it takes us away, or it takes me at least away from questions that I really care about more.
I think for me, in my graduate degree, the classes we were teaching were often accused of being overly politicized, or we were grading on politics. If you wrote something that the professor in CSCL, disagreed with, you would be penalized. And in thinking about that as I taught myself, a lot of it came down to, what is your argument? Can you back up your claims in some way? And it's expanding upon this, if you can have radical different interpretations of a data set, of the same data set, but having those forums, not just in comment sections, but as ways to challenge and say, I think of the paper with was it the World Bank that is using this particular data set and this particular equation to structure a lot of their programs, and then when they release the data, there's a miscalculation in there. And having that, that ability, I think, an academic institution, though it shouldn't just be limited to, has this history of debate and not necessarily consensus and things like that, and refinement and argument. And so I think that's a space for this that isn't just in faculty seminars or graduate seminars, but is in student groups and in libraries and throughout the campus as well. So I think it is in trying to, and I agree with Alex. I'm not concerned as much about that labeling of someone as a responsible academic versus a political agenda. It's more about how you are using this data, for what ends, what kind of arguments are you making, who's funding you, and seeing, examining the different contextual pieces about that, and then, hearing your argument, me making my argument, and extrapolating that further out. Bill,
Yeah, well, now hearing what you've said, I think it would be a restatement of what you said, which is basically try to bring the rigor of academics to public policy discussions or public affairs discussions. And I don't think that necessarily means every debate has to become a dissertation defense. But politicians and community leaders will often make statements that just fly in the face of what is pretty generally accepted within certain academic fields, and the academic fields tend to stay pretty quiet. And I think there's a space in there in which an academic can basically just raise a question. How did you come to that conclusion without I believe without endangering their unbiased, their politically neutral, unbiased place in society.
And without necessarily becoming a talking head that goes into that specific form of kind of public scholarship where you need to boil everything down to sound bites and things like that. And so, so maybe this is an increased role, one second, Rebecca, increased role of, public scholarship. And I look to public history as a great example of this, and who are engaging in making different public-facing projects with historical information of various kinds. Sometimes this is in a museum setting, and I've worked on a project examining how certain historical museums are treating certain controversial subjects, and these are spaces for conversation. When you see a certain panelist or description and things like that, so it's building things, but also building spaces as well.
My question is kind of twofold. It's can data ever be unbiased? It's kind of I love your metaphor, or the metaphor that you talked about, that you tend to gather information for a specific reason. So it's, from the very beginning, how you gather that data is going to have some kind of an agenda, whether it be, good or evil. But then, okay, so say we're all gathering data for various purposes, and we're hoping to find open data, and do we have a place to put this data that others can then find it more easily, so they don't have to go through the same process again? So the first you don't have to necessarily comment on. I guess it's a truism. It's like history. Those who write history are the ones who get to tell the story. Those who gather data are the ones who get to tell the story. But are we at least attempting through this open data movement to move it into a neutral, if we've determined that the government may not be such a place, or institutions may not be such a place, or is there a neutral space?
I would quickly modify the question a little bit. Like, I don't really believe that we gather data. I think we create it. And I think that change in language is really important, because I think when we say we gather data, data is out there somewhere. And if we go look for it, we can put it together. But like you mentioned, Rebecca, the choices that we're making about what we gather and what we look at and how we frame it all go into shaping how that data gets there. There's a really great study called Digital Dead End by Virginia Eubanks. There's a book that came out a couple years ago. And in it, she looks at many very low-income people who are interacting with the social services system and the ways that they interact with data systems that gather data about them. And I think one of the most interesting things about that is, and any social worker, I'm in social work, but knows and experiences this regularly, people work the system with a lot of agency. They're not unconsciously sitting in there having data gathered about them. They're creating that data very actively. So if it's gonna help them get by today, I'm gonna make up a little bit of data that you're gonna put into your system that eventually will go into those columns that someone laid out. And so the data that goes into all of those columns is not only not just gathered neutrally, it's completely created, and it's completely created at a very micro level depending on how people respond. So just one thought to add to that, and then other experts who know way more about that than me can speak to the second part.
There's a great book called Raw Data is an Oxymoron.
Yeah,
Lisa Gittleman is the editor of that book and gets at that very question.
Yes. Yeah, there's Gödel Escher-Bach also kind of gets to that question of, and I think comes to the conclusion that there's just no such thing as a single piece of data. You look at every piece of data in a context, and even things like, even representations of data have a context with them. I think to the second question, certainly, at least with government information, it's almost always, the frame has largely been a government has to provide their own place. Oftentimes, they're actually contracting with companies, but they're the ones kind of placed in charge of making sure that this data is made available. I haven't seen too much. I think maybe with the exception of, I believe, Cook County, their open data portal is actually managed by the Smart Chicago Collaborative, which is part of the Chicago Community Trust. That's one of the only that's one of the only instances I can think of a non-governmental entity kind of being in charge of the leading of a government data portal. I think in general that question is going to come up more. I know in the city of Minneapolis, the question came up. So under the Data Practices Act, there are retention schedules. A government has to keep a certain piece of data for at least as long as they've said they will. And within some governments, that's kind of treated as like a calendar. So it's we keep this data for 10 years. 10 years from today, we are destroying this data. And I think 10 years from now, we as a broader community need to have some way to decide. We think that data is really important to keep for posterity. We need to put it somewhere. And I don't know, maybe you know this better, but I feel doesn't the Minnesota Historical Society keep some information kind of once it's gone off retention?
I don't know that.
Okay.
I can look into that. I don't know about that.
We just launched a data repository here at the libraries, and a lot of our conversations were, in having scholars depositing their data, it's, well, you may not think about this usage of your data as, this isn't just like checking your results. We're going to look at, perhaps on an epistemological level, of how these practices were done as a field in this much wider view, in some ways you didn't even think about. But that means saving a lot more data. And then we quickly run into space concerns, and we quickly run into interface concerns.
And for a long time, the economics have just been such that we are creating more information as a society than we are producing hard drive space to store it. And that's just like the divergence of those lines have been growing for years. So it's like every time we store something, we're making a conscious decision. We value this information more than the other information.
And format problems too. I know in the federal government documents collections, we have CD-ROMs that, somebody will pull up at doing a search in our catalog and say, forget it, I'm not searching around for a viewer.
We have a computer now that can read all these old CD-ROMs.
And they do exist within the library too. We have one for the government documents, but I think it scares people away when they find it in the search results.
Excuse me. My name is Amy West. I worked with Justin on a project that came up with the repository, and for a while I also worked in government publications in the library. So, ironically, almost all those CD-ROMs should work just fine. Actually, the last time I checked, it's been about 6 months. But
I know I can't play it on this.
No, you can't, and I agree that it absolutely terrifies people. And thankfully, most of the time you don't have to go to them. But it's probably the only area where I found myself typically disagreeing with some of the open data activists gets back to the question of what's biased and what's not. You often hear conversations that will go, the government should prioritize the creation of data in shareable forms because their presentation is inherently untrustworthy because it'll be biased. You should let someone else look at it. And several issues with that sort of line of reasoning. One, that, well, okay, if it's inherently biased coming from the entity that produced it, it's going to be biased by someone else because obviously someone's going to look at it to try to get from here to there. But also, I think it's a responsibility of a government, whether it's federal, state, or local, to give you some indication of what they think is important. Like on the one hand, it's frustrating if a local police department pulls data out of public view in some way. On the other hand, when they do that, that tells you a lot about sort of their priorities and their policies, and being able to see how the entity that's produced the information views the parts of it that are important, I think is a crucial part of sort of understanding the world around you. And so it's not so much bias that concerns me as limited options for the availability of the data, that there's only one way to get it, and that one way happens to be one way that lines up with what the producer wants. That, ideally it'd be available in multiple forms so that there are multiple people who can produce their applications.
There is a really cool new software application that's in development. I don't usually jump back to software as a solution to some of these things, but there's a really cool piece of software called DAT, which is, I don't know if you're up to date on it. I'm not very up to date on it, but they've been developing it for a while. It's supposed to basically be possible to, in a decentralized way, store and version data sets. So people could grab versioned data sets. So like if it's been changed over time or something, grab the most recent version or older versions of it and put them on their own computer, or send those back to a central source. So I could pull an unclean data set, clean it, and then send it back to a central source, and people could choose which one they wanted to pull. So I think there's some strategies. Linked open data is another interesting big thing that libraries are doing a lot of work with, but a lot of strategies to figure out how the heck do we deal with this mass of data. And what are some of the tools that we start to use to make it accessible broadly, and to have multiple sources be able to create, host, and then analyze it. I think that's a really interesting question. Gosh, they got a really new website now. It's great.
Well, we're at 4:30, so I just want to say if there's any final thoughts that panelists want to share. sure any upcoming events that you want to make sure people go to, or things like that?
Yeah, so definitely a couple of events. Open Twin Cities is having a book club. Today's Wednesday, right?
Yes.
In 6 days. We're actually we're welcoming Aja Gildersleeve of the city of Minneapolis. We're gonna talk about race. We're gonna talk about why that's important for civic technologists to have a conception around. And we're also having our monthly meetup on November 25th. And then finally, Hennepin County is having a hackathon on February 21st and 22nd that Open Twin Cities is partnering on. So if you want to know what a hackathon is, check out Geocode.
Tell me about this book club. Do I have to have the book read in 6 days?
No. Okay. And also, it's actually just a couple chapters, so you probably could actually read it, but no, you don't need to. Just be interested in the topic.
Yeah, it'll be a presentation or kind of workshop.
Something else is just go check out the Open Knowledge Cast if you're interested. It's at okcast.org. Bill has done an interview with me, and I'm hoping that others will be helping do that as well soon. But I will be there's 2 conferences next week, one called OpenCon that's about open access primarily, and early career researchers doing open access work, and Open Ed, which is really about open education and thinking about open educational resources. So I'll be doing a lot of audio coverage and some video as well from those 2 conferences that will be headed back this way.
All right. I guess one last thing is City of Minneapolis should have an open data platform site up like this month.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for all our panelists for today. Thanks to everybody here for joining us for the event. Let's give them. So we won't have a Dash event next month because no one comes to December events because everyone's busy. We will announce the slate of spring events soon. Thanks a lot and stay warm since it's now winter.